Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Meldon.
It's great to be here at the Library of Virginia.
Yes, it is.
Yes, located right here in downtown Richmond on Broad Street. A lot of people get the Library of Virginia confused with the Richmond Public Library downtown on Franklin Street where we work, but we're here at the Library of Virginia. It used to be the State Library, and today we're here because of the good people that work at the Library of Virginia, including Ann Henderson, and they have an exhibit going on, which you've been to,
yes,
called We Demand Women's Suffrage in Virginia. Exciting, isn't it?
Yes, very great exhibit, and they've extended it to March, I believe, of 21. Is that right, Britt?
Right.
Great. Yeah, I can't wait to see it. So we're here today having a conversation about suffragists with Brent Tarter. Brent Tarter is here with us today, and we're so glad to have you, Mr. Tarter. Just a few words about him. Brent Tarter is a Texas native, graduated from Angelo State College, and did his graduate work at the University of Virginia with a primary research interest in early 20th century political history. He has worn a lot of hats at the Library of Virginia here. From 1982 to 2010, he was a senior editor at the Library of Virginia, a founding editor of the library's Dictionary of Virginia Biography Project. He's the author of numerous articles in scholarly journals on various aspects of Virginia history. And he's the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 16 books, including Gerrymanders, How Redistricting Has Protected Slavery, White Supremacy, and Partisan Minorities in Virginia. I mentioned that one because that's the next one I intend to read.
Yeah. Well, one story you want to explore today is the men and the men's involvement in women's suffrage.
Well, that's something that has been inadequately researched to date because we've focused on the leadership of the suffrage movement. The leadership was all women. Too many people have looked only at the women because they assume, well, this is a male-female issue, but it's not. At the beginning of the 20th century, when the modern woman suffrage movement was just beginning, I think it's quite clear that a large majority of all men and all women opposed woman suffrage. You know, at that time, this is right at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, social mores were such that middle and upper class white women in particular believed that the role of women in society should be as good wives and good mothers in the household. Now, you could involve yourself with issues like alcohol and public education and public health because those are family issues, but not real politics, not running for office and campaigning and voting. And most men, I think, agreed to separate the public and the private spheres. The men did the public stuff, they worked and raised money to manage the families, and they did the politics. Women were supposed to manage the children and the household.
In other words, the women managed inside the house and the men managed outside the house.
Exactly. the separate spheres, they were called. Well, a lot of people worried that if suddenly you begin breaking down those traditional gender roles, and if women start doing things that men did, was that dangerous for the family? Did that endanger religion even? Because women were regarded as the peculiar repositories of religious and moral teaching for the children. Get women out in the dirty business of politics. That's no good. People worried about religion, they worried about socialism, they worried about saloon keepers in politics. One thing that's really striking when you look back in the 19-teens and you read what opponents of woman suffrage were saying, they used some of the same arguments and some of the same language that opponents of the Equal Rights Amendment have been making in the last few years here. It's striking how much similar there is, because we still have views and roles about what is proper for people to be doing and what it's not proper for people to be doing. All of which is to say, most men opposed woman suffrage when the idea first came up. I think most women did too in the beginning. The job of the woman suffrage advocates was to convince the men to change their minds, because the men were the ones with the political power to change the law.
Yes.
Change state constitutions or change the federal constitution. Now, it's not just a male-female issue, though. You know, there were many, many women who opposed woman suffrage, right up until 1920.
Wow.
There was a Virginia Association opposed to woman suffrage that had a very large female membership and entirely women officers. But on the other hand, there were also men who favored woman suffrage, more of them than we would have thought.
Well, that started way back in the early 1800s with
Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass, and then
in the 1840s.
Kathy, didn't your research turn up some?
Yeah, we found
a federal judge.
The federal judge, John C. Underwood.
Yeah, John C. Underwood.
And I was impressed. I was reading about him, and I was so impressed. He was sort of called a radical.
He was.
I wanted, in the 1868 Constitutional Convention, he's talking about, he addressed the black suffrage, and he also addressed women's suffrage.
So far as I have been able to learn, that's the first time that a man in Virginia advocated votes for women.
Yeah,
it's interesting, though, that he made that proposal in the Constitutional Convention, and not one single member made a formal motion to put that into the state constitution. So that idea died almost as soon as his finished speaking. Now, there was a short-lived small woman suffrage organization formed in 1870, right here in Richmond, as a matter of fact, a woman named Anna Whitehead Boddicker. And Judge Underwood and his wife both joined. Not enough people joined that it gained any momentum.
Yes.
But, you know, this was in the air. The 1860s was a time of thinking outside the box and thinking about reforms. But it was premature. There weren't any other men willing to go along with him. And at that time, there were not yet enough women to be interested either. But it just shows, you know, there have always been some men who believed that votes for women was a good thing. You notice how much he talks about the household.
Yes.
About the place that women had in preserving morality and the family. Well, that's playing to that traditional gender role that I mentioned a few minutes ago, that this was women's responsibilities for the family. And if they had political influence, they could pursue the family's interests more effectively.
Yes.
And that argument eventually began to resonate in the 19-teens. So the Underwood speech is really a remarkable event, but as I say, it just died on the vine right there.
Did the Equal Suffrage League that the women had, did that include male members?
Yes, the Equal Suffrage League was founded in Richmond in November of 1909 to obtain the vote for women on equal terms with men. And there were men who joined the Equal Suffrage League. In fact, in Richmond, Lila Meade Valentine, who was the president of the State League, actually founded a men's Equal Suffrage League of Virginia. Included a lot of prominent Richmond businessmen and lawyers and educators and the like. We don't have any records to indicate what they did, though. I just really don't know. There's a long list of people who endorsed woman suffrage, especially in 1910 and 12 when they were petitioning the General Assembly. Lots of men signed on, including H.J. Eckenrode, who was the state archivist right here at what was then the Virginia State Library. He signed on. A Richmond member of the House of Delegates named Hill Montague introduced a woman suffrage amendment into the General Assembly in 1912. So, you know, there were men who were out there taking public roles. They were definitely a minority but they were there. They were there.
That's
there's a picture of Hill Montague, yeah. I don't know much about him either. I should have taken more time to learn something else about him, but you know, you can't do everything in the world in a short time. Yeah, and you know, from the very beginning there were men involved in this. The Equal Suffrage League was founded in November of 1909. In January of 1910, the League lobbied the General Assembly for passage of a state constitutional amendment. Lyon G. Tyler, the president of the College of William and Mary, wrote a little pamphlet about equal rights for women. The Equal Suffrage League printed copies of it and placed a copy on the desk of every member of the House of Delegates at the opening of the 1910 session. So there's a very public endorsement by a very prominent Virginia gentleman. Lyon G. Tyler was son of old President John Tyler from before the Civil War.
Yeah.
So, you know, he's taking a very progressive stance on women voting as well as on other rights of women. So he was way ahead of his time. His wife, by the way, was the founding president of the Equal Suffrage League of Williamsburg. So they're prominent people, just not enough. And most of them were not in the General Assembly.
And there was a league in Norfolk?
I'm sorry?
There was a chapter in Norfolk.
Yes, there was a lot of people. There were chapters everywhere. In Lynchburg, they formed a Lynchburg Equal Suffrage League for men. We don't have any records. We don't know what they did. Rural Brunswick County in 1915 or 16, when they founded the Brunswick County Equal Suffrage League, there's one reference, 2 words that said Men's Committee. So they at least tried to engage men to take part in the Equal Suffrage League work in the countryside as well. But as I say, we have almost no records of what they did. We have good records of what the women did in the larger cities, and some records about what women did in many of the smaller cities and counties. Let me mention 2 other men who were very prominent, who endorsed woman suffrage early on.
Who were they?
John Garland Pollard, another Richmond person. He was elected Attorney General of Virginia in 1913. He supported woman suffrage. His sister, Mary Pollard Clark, was very active in the Equal Suffrage League. She worked in the state office and lobbied and made speeches for years and years and years. Then the next Attorney General, John Saunders, who was elected in 1917, he voted for woman suffrage in the General Assembly before he was elected Attorney General. His wife was an officer of the Equal Suffrage League of Saluda in Middlesex County. So these people are all over the place. It's just kind of, you know, it's a thin distribution of suffrage men throughout the state in the beginning. Some of them were very prominent.
Wow. So it seems like over the years it built up.
It built up, and it built up because the women of the Equal Suffrage League and the women of the Virginia chapter of the National Women's Party were very effective educators. They made speeches from courthouse steps or at county fairs or at state fairs or at church bazaars. They put on suffrage plays in the schools. They handed out literature. They organized. From November 1909 until the middle of 1919, the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia grew from about 24 women to 20,000.
Wow.
It was the largest non-military organization of Virginians in history to that time. They had chapters all over the place, more than 140 chapters throughout the state. They were extraordinarily effective organizers. This story's never been told. They were extraordinarily successful organizers, and they were persistent and diligent and imaginative. Ultimately, they were persuasive because suffrage resolutions went down to defeat in the House of Delegates in 1912 and 1914. Again in 1916, but by a much smaller margin. So they were making progress. They were convincing the men that the women were right, that voting for women should be considered a right of citizenship. And that these women who were working for public health and public education improvements and for better laboring conditions and for temperance and prohibition, they deserved the vote.
Yes.
Because they were doing work that was good in the community, in the public sphere that had been reserved to men. They were expanding their role outside the House to take advantage of the opportunity to change laws. So they succeeded. By 1920, they actually persuaded the General Assembly to propose a state woman suffrage amendment. Now, it's too late to do any good because in 1920, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified. They never took the next step in 1922 of submitting that woman suffrage amendment to the voters for ratification. This has been almost completely forgotten. But it shows how successful these women almost were, which in turn tells us they were good. They were persuading those men who did not want any woman suffrage at the beginning of the decade to vote overwhelmingly for woman suffrage in March of 1920. Now, those same men voted against the 19th Amendment.
What?
Well, and this is race again.
Oh.
They didn't want the federal government telling the states what to do about voting because the federal government had already imposed black suffrage on the states in 1870. And they didn't want the federal government taking a hand in unraveling their disfranchisement of black people. This is pure unadulterated racism.
No,
but the women persuaded the white politicians in sufficient numbers that even though they wouldn't ratify the 19th Amendment, they would propose a woman suffrage amendment to the state constitution. And that's a remarkable part of the story that has never been told before.
But wasn't there one man in the a Republican that approved or voted for the federal amendment?
Yes, C. Bascom Slemp was a congressman from the 9th District in Southwestern
How much do we know
Virginia.
about him?
We know a good deal about him. An interesting somebody. The Southwest Virginia became a Republican stronghold at the end of the 19th century, when the rest of the state was mostly Democratic. Slemp's father had been a member of Congress. When he retired in 1900, C. Bascom Slemp ran for Congress as a Republican, and he won, and he served for 20 years. At this time, in the early part of the 20th century, Southern Republicans were much more progressive than Southern Democrats. I mean, that changed in the 20th century. But at that time, Southern Republicans looked more favorably on woman suffrage than Southern Democrats did. So, you know, the 10 Virginia congressmen in 1916, 1918, 1920, Bascom Slemp was the only one who ever voted for the 19th Amendment. All of the other Virginia congressmen were opposed, and both Virginia senators were opposed.
Wow.
So, you know, there's a partisan angle here, there's a race angle here, there are gender relations that figure in this, and then there's that great work that the woman suffragists did of persuasion.
So, if anyone is interested, they can get your book at the Richmond Public Library, and some of your other books too.
Well, once again, thank you for inviting me to take part, and thank you for coming down to the library today.
Yes, we're so happy to be here.
Yes, great. I love the library.
Well, I've worked in libraries all of my adult life. I'm not a librarian, I'm an historian, but where would we be without the library?
Yeah,
where
true.
would we be?
That's true.
That's so true. Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
If the men should see the women going to the polls to put down the liquor traffic, need it vex their souls. If we're angels as they tell us, can we want some...